So it's wonderful to see you all. But Annalise Ruiz just emailed me and said that from Alpine, they awarded over 200 biliteracy seals. So, I'm giving kudos to people who are doing, amazing work despite kind of the conditions. And Christy from Weber. Hi, Christy. And Thais from Ogden. So it's nice to see everybody. We're going to wait a few more minutes and then I'll set the context for purposes in relationship to building the capacity of not only the ALS directors, but literacy people and principals and other people who have joined us to really think about the kinds of questions, inquiry questions, and then the data sets that would help you better understand who our learners are and what their needs are. And then I'll give you some concrete examples of the way Aaron and I have done that. Aaron is my right-hand guy. He's been incredibly responsive to doing innovative things and supporting the work that we do for federal programs. So, it's great to have colleagues who are so committed to ensuring equitable access to grade level content because pretty much, good morning, Wendy, because that's pretty much what the ESSA people have asked us at the federal government. And good morning, Stacy. They've actually said, well, how are you actually going to ensure that every multilingual learner has access to grade level content? And so then, because of that, that changes the way in which we think about academic language in the content. So I'm going to give you some examples of places where that kind of work is going on in innovative ways and that we're going to film and do mini documentaries. Good morning, Whitney. Good morning, Bev. So I'm just going to highlight a couple of things. One is, and it's on our playlist, which is, it's the second thing actually on my USB e-signature. The first one is the link to all the courses in our catalog. So the ESL endorsement courses as well as other opportunities, cultivating compassion courses. And then the second one is promising practices. And then you can click on there and you'll see over the last year and a half the promising practices that we have done. Good morning, Carrie. Nice to see you. And then we have, the USB portal where you can put in requests for professional learning. And just a reminder about professional learning, if you remember the way in which you assess the way you do and provide professional learning based on, like 30 years of research and ESSA requirements for compliance, it can't be a one-shot thing, right? That doesn't change anybody's practice. Good morning, Martin. Morning, Tracy. Welcome. And so that's why we have a practitioner's catalog for sustained professional learning that is embedded in their classroom practices. That's actually how change happens. It's not like a one-stop, I'm going to talk to you for a short workshop and we think that their practices are going to change. So I just wanted to make that clear. That's pretty much that's in federal law. In relationship how funds are spent to make sure that it's connected to outcomes for students. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples of really interesting things that we're going to do mini documentaries on. Because for me, the question always ends up being, if our task is to ensure that every multilingual learner has access to grade level content, then where are the examples in Utah where that's happening? I'm a California kid and I grew up there, but I'm not really interested in what California is doing because we have great teachers and we're doing really innovative things in Utah. It's much easier to disseminate promising practices in Utah with exemplary work than it is to, obviously, COVID is good because we don't really have to travel. Well, you can travel, but it makes a difference because sometimes that makes people think that there's an answer somewhere else and that there actually is an answer. Okay, so welcome to Annalise. Annalise, I was just bragging about all your biliteracy seals. So I don't know. Do you want to jump in? We're talking about promising practices before we start the actual session with Erin. Well, she might pop in. So one example, and it's on the playlist, is what Park City has done through the work of Melanie Moffat at Park City. The Summer Dream Big program for multilingual learners to prepare them for advanced coursework, specifically AP work, has changed the data set and the future of multilingual learners from an ACT score of 12 to an ACT score of 22. And even though we don't really focus on that, we focus on what happens when those particular students, our students from Park City, end up being in AP classes and they don't feel alienated from the rest of the students who typically are, the students that are in those classes and have access to it. And so I would really, recommend, especially because of the COVID gap in learning, that you go to the playlist and listen to Melanie and the design that they've done. So they've been doing this for 5 years, and their partnership is with USU. So their data is really incredible. And believe it or not, their enrollment in the Summer Bridge program is the highest it's ever been. So that's one really excellent example. Ogden also, 2 years ago, they organized an amazing summer program and kept data to show the impact and the engagement of families in the education of their students in general and multilingual students in particular. And they braided funds in a really innovative way because Ogden is really great at doing that. So I haven't asked them yet, but, we'll actually, I think Alex and Alex from the recording studio, we've already started making inroads and talking to people about doing mini documentaries about the way it's structured and the way in which students respond, because the best feedback you get is always from the students. And then the other really innovative summer program is going to be at East High with Rebecca Richardson and Aisha, and I can't remember her last name, but she's this incredibly amazing chemistry teacher, and they're going to do a summer school, and they've changed all their work. As you know, East High is detracking their 9th and 10th grade courses, and they're doing proficiency grading just as, Granite has been the leader of that. So I'm giving you like really concrete examples of amazing work already being done in Utah to disseminate, to upscale, and to learn from. So with that, I'm going to do the introduction to Erin and set the context. So, and Erin might want to say something about the reason they were tasked by the USBE leadership to gather statewide equity data. But let me just set the context. When you want to recognize schools and build their capacity to better understand the relationship between program effectiveness, evaluating that, getting feedback and adjusting it in relationship to student outcomes, then you have to start with an inquiry question, right? Because you want to actually recognize those schools in your districts that are actually achieving that, and then learning from them and highlighting and recognizing the conditions that they've actually created to ensure that their programs are effective related to learning outcomes. See, that's the point. You just can't keep on doing a program over and over and over again and think you're going to have different results. I think that's some kind of definition of insanity. That just doesn't work. So here's the inquiry question that Erin and I used to do the USBE recognitions. Now, it was really challenging to figure out the inquiry question for high schools. For elementary, it was pretty easy. The question was, which schools can we recognize that actually have, during the year before COVID, and we're using that as a baseline to see the gaps and what schools will be doing in the summer school to mitigate those gaps and throughout remote learning, to identify schools that generally have conditions where people actually think that mitigates progress. So one was percentage of high poverty, that was a criteria, a high percentage, an enrollment, certain enrollment level, like 400 up. And then the other one was the percentage of students who are multilingual learners. And I'm using multilingual learners because I want us to realize that oftentimes students that I've been working with at Utah International and East High, yeah, English is one of their languages, but oftentimes it's not just their second. Like I've worked with students whose it's actually their seventh language, or their fifth language, or their sixth language, right? So assuming that they're second language learners or they're ESL students is not really honoring the way in which language is used as a benefit to connect with our global community in Utah, which is going to expand because I'm meeting with the resettlement agencies and the quota on refugee families is increasing. That we need we all need to talk about that in August. So I was looking at conditions that people have actually biases against or prejudices against because they think, well, that's a school that has high poverty and whatever they think, and I don't really know how to teach English learners, and we need to pull them out of the classroom. And then because we redesigned the accountability system to do individualized, personalized annual growth goals for every single student in Utah, for when they came into the system and at what level of proficiency they actually had achieved, then we have this great opportunity, and also with the individual reports on the USBE Data Gateway, to really help students see their assets, like what they can do, and set goals for the next year. Right? All those resources are critical in relationship to identifying which schools are doing really innovative things. So that was the criteria for elementary and middle. The high school was a little bit different. We still used high poverty and a fairly high percentage of students learning English and a percentage of students making their annual growth goal. But what we changed, or what we added, not so much the annual growth goal, because as you all know, when students come in, the transition between elementary and middle and high school, there's like a leveling off and then a loss for increased language proficiency and not equitable access to rigorous coursework. So the question I thought of was, which are the high schools that are closing the opportunity gap, and students who are multilingual learners are in career and college courses and are being successful. So Aaron put all the variables in, and we organized it. And of course, we found high schools like East High who have actually mitigated the equity gap for early college coursework, as well as the work that's being done in Davis and Park City, among other places, many high schools in Granite. So I would like you all to think of an inquiry question based on the kind of conditions, and because this is being transcribed, you don't have to write it down, the kind of conditions that you would identify for promising practices to upscale and disseminate and learn from, so you can kind of make a shift in the way people tend to think about, who are the real learners, and who is going to be successful and who has access. Okay, So that's kind of the frame. So I'm going to turn it over to Aaron, and he'll tell you why uh, he was given this charge. And they worked on this for months and months and and months. And then Aaron and I worked on it for you all. So we're pretty lucky to have Aaron. So I just want to thank you, Aaron, for all your work. So do you want to introduce?
You bet. I'm hoping someone just turned my mic on. The planes have been flying over all morning. Hopefully you haven't heard those. Um, anyway, with that said, Aaron Bruff, I'm with Data and Statistics here at the State Board of Education. Again, it's a pleasure to work with Christelle and Becky Donaldson and all of them here. And I've worked with a number of you on occasions. Just know I think the world of you. You're fantastic. Um, with that said, the data that we've looked at, so Christelle went over, let's find the spotlights or the highlights. Um, well, fantastic work that she's doing. But the secondary job that we'll be presenting to you today was, okay, do we actually have evidence of disparity with the students here in Utah? What can we see? Can we actually see empirical proof that there is a gap? I'm going to start sharing my screen. Let me put this in.
And just remember that if you have a question, you're going to put it in the chat, and then I'll just say to Aaron, we have a question, okay? And make sure everybody's muted.
Which one are you seeing? Are you seeing a split screen or are you seeing a single screen?
Single screen.
All right, it's working as expected. Wonderful, thank you. And again, I won't be looking at the chat so much. So if you have a question, please drop it in. And Christelle, you chime in and stop me. So this is a presentation that we gave to the Standards and Assessment Committee 4 months ago, 3 months, I don't know. It does blur a little bit. We didn't show them all the information we'll be displaying to you. But again, this is what was presented for them to kind of discuss what is happening, what is the state of education. When we look at the student groups and basically do a gap analysis for the entire state. And so as we start off on a gap analysis, really looking at this slide, it's like, is there any evidence to suggest that there are barriers to high quality learning opportunities and improving outcomes among different demographic groups of students that we track? And that was the primary question that we tried to answer. And as anyone does a gap analysis, these are the key questions that we share, and I share with you, and I would recommend actually writing these down somewhere. Number one, what are the key policies, programs and practices in Utah, in your district, that are aimed to reduce the barriers to high quality learning opportunities and improve outcomes? Just alone that exercise of saying, what are these policies that we're pursuing, is powerful. Just make sure that you can identify them. Hopefully that's an easy question for you to answer. The second one is there any evidence to suggest these policies, programs, and practices are effective? That gets a little tricky, but it's important to start digging into these, the actual empirical evidence. What evidences can we find that actually point to this? And then how do we increase the quality of education opportunities for all of our students? Again, this is the purpose of a gap analysis. What are we seeing inside of there, and how do what we see support our policies? So moving forward, as a state, we looked at multiple areas. We looked at academic outcomes and then student experiences, and then we kind of broke this into two areas. So we look at the Acadience reading, that's the K through 3 reading. We looked at the state content test. That was the CRTs of about 10, 15 years ago. It's the SAGE test, it's the RICE test, the Utah Aspire Plus test. Those end of course or end of grade level assessments that are administered. We looked at the graduation rates. We looked at intergenerational poverty, which is a particular one that, as a state, was identified as an area that we need to really look at and focus because of that unique population. And then we looked at the students' experience. We looked at special education. We looked at incident and disciplinary data. We looked at the information that came from the SHARP surveys. Again, participation in the IGP programs. And we're running a number of pilots for the social emotional learning. We looked at that and looked at the impact. So again, we were looking for evidences that suggest that there was a disparity. So as we start off, academic outcomes, and this is the Acadience reading as we look at this data. So first off, here's what we did is we just pulled it out and graphed it out and said, okay, from 2006 through 2019, what do we see? That top line is your state average. And then we can see, well, what is the score, the percentages of students who are making at or above the benchmark for the economically disadvantaged students. We looked at the EL learners, and then we looked at the students with disability, and you can see it breaks down between those. So yes, there is a difference between those. And as we go into this, discuss, well, how do you know what's the impact of those difference in lines? Moving forward to the next slide. Then we also did this by race ethnicity. So again, it's kind of reddish, it's a red-brown line between the 70 and 80%, that is the state average. And you can see that there are 3 groups that are above that line, and then there are 4 groups that are below it, the 3 above it. Again, where the white population, it is the 2 or more races, and it's the Asian group. As we look at those who are below, it's the Pacific Islanders, followed next by the Black African Americans, the Hispanic Latino, and finally at the American Indians. And you can see across time, okay, what are the patterns? What are we seeing inside of here? What's going on with race, ethnicity? Then we started looking at the state content tests. So again, language arts, math, science, 3rd through 11th grade. Again, 11th grade was removed. And so we had a couple of ways that we looked at those. So as we were reviewing the data in there, we really said, what is the better way of reviewing this information or presenting it back? And the idea is, this statistical idea for those who love stats is using the effect size. And really, the effect size is the statistical concept that measures the strength of a relationship between 2 variables on a numeric scale. And so here's the example we have in here. We have data on the height of men and women, and we notice that on average, men are taller than women. The importance of the difference between the height of men and the height of women is measured with the effect size. And so in using the Cohen's effect size, which is the difference of the 2 populations means, and is divided by the standard deviation of the data. Again, throwing statistical words at you. This allows us to describe the difference between 2 groups as, is it a small difference? Is it a medium difference, or is it large? It is also used to determine if the difference between 2 proportions is meaningful. And so that's, again, it's important as we jump back and we look at those gaps or those differences. Are they large, or are they small, or are they medium, or is it really not that impactful? Just because they're on different levels could mean different things. And so that's why we implemented the effect size review of it. So as we look at the Cohen's effect size rule of thumb, it says the greater the effect size, the greater the performance difference between the students groups. This allows you to go beyond testing for statistical significance, because sometimes you just say, is this significance or not? The answer is often, yes, it's significant. However, to what extent? And so the numbers, as they get calculated, say a difference of a 0.2 is considered small. If it's 0.5, the difference, again, you're now getting into that medium range, and then a 0.8 is a large difference, meaning, yeah, there's something definitely going on inside of there that we're seeing. So what we did on the first part is we did a 12-year review. We looked at the CRTs. That's the old Utah Criterion Reference Test, went from 2003 to 2013. The grades were 1 through 12. We looked at the SAGE tests from 2014 through 2018. Again, these were 3rd through 10th grade. And then the RISE, which are the current ones, we had the results from 2019. This is a 3rd through 8th grade. And the Utah Aspire Plus, which is 9th and 10th grade, which is an end of grade level assessment. Slightly different, but we were able to take and look at all of these data and kind of do a blending review on these and said, what kind of impact did we have? So the next 3 slides are just jam-packed full of data, and it's a little hard to read because there's so much information that we're presenting there. Basically what it says is, over the 12 years that we did this review, was there a difference? And the number, if you can see the number, I'm wearing glasses so I can look in on it, but the number would then tell you, is this a significant amount or not? So this is what we're seeing in English language arts. This is what we saw in mathematics. And this is what we saw in science. Again, we were looking at the patterns. Could we identify any trends or movements or changes within the students' performance? As we looked at this, again, what we're comparing them to is not the test, percent proficiency from year to year, but we're saying, as a group, how much do you perform above or below that state average for the given year, or that mean? And as we're looking at that mean, do we see a gap increasing, decreasing, or just maintaining throughout? So again, we're looking for patterns inside of here. Again, hard to read. So this is what we did, is we averaged those 12 years into a single chart. And so as you can see in this one right here, we looked at English language arts by race, ethnicity, and we looked at the gap size. So I'll ask the question, and if someone can respond, who or what student group has a small effect size? Christelle, let's see if someone can answer that. And tell me what the effect size is that you chose. Again, I can't see the chat. So is anyone responding?
Yeah, it's William Evans. To everyone, he's saying it's a 0.1 multiple of races. Somebody, Debbie Deem, is saying ELA Asian, it's a 0.2. So why don't you explain, Aaron?
Okay. That's good. Thank you for answering. So yes, that 0.1, that 0.2. So you see on top, the Asian multiple races is a small effect size. They're not outperforming. So there is a statistical significance that could be identified, but the effect size is small. It's anywhere from a 0 to a 0.1 or 0.2. When we look at mathematics for the Asians, it's a 0.4. Do you remember when I explained the effect size, what the Cohen's rule of thumbs were? Do you remember what those numbers were? And again, I'm asking, I want a little bit of interaction, not just sitting back and.
Yeah, well, I think so. Someone is saying it's a 0.5 was medium.
I'm going to jump back to it so they can see it. Good.
Yeah, point eight is large.
Yeah. Fantastic. Again, I wanted to go back and just circle back on these numbers to say these are kind of important to keep in your mind as you go through and look at these effect size. Are we talking a small difference, a medium difference, or a large difference? So let's jump back down to this slide. As we look at the Pacific Islanders, the Hispanic Latino, the African American, and the African American Black and the American Indian are those small, medium, or large? Obviously, the answer is they're large.
Yeah.
They're quite large. Um, in fact, so the question is there empirical evidence that there's this gap, if you will, or this imbalance between the performance of the students over a 12-year average? And the answer is absolutely. Can we see this difference in the data? We also looked at low income. We looked at students with disability. We looked at English learners and said, what kind of gap size are we going to see inside of there over a 12-year review of all the data that we had inside of there? Again, if you were not low income, you had a 0.5 above. If you were a low income, it was at 0.8, 0.9. That in and of itself was large. The students with disability, a 0.9, and then the English learners was a 2.7, a 2.4, and a 2.7.
Okay, so Aaron, so another way to think about this is all of Hattie's work that uses size effect on practices that actually have a positive related to annual growth for practices and structures and collective efficacy and collaboration. So that's another way to think about this. And I think one of the things that's really important is this is over 12 years. I mean, we're not we're not talking about a short time. And so then the question is the idea of actually how well, really it's about our capacity. How do we build our capacity to change our practices to ensure high quality instruction for every single student? Right? I mean, that's really the point. And you can see that with the discrepancies that we have some important questions to ask ourselves, and not in a blaming way, but in a community of learning way. I mean, that's really the point. So
Yeah.
Martin is asking. So Robin is asking what is our order? I don't actually know what that. Robin, do you want to say what that means?
Great
Oh,
question.
an
And
order.
it's a silly answer. An R order is simply a coding word that I use to drop things in sequence. So if I went back in here, you'd see it's not showing on that one. It's just a code word that I use. It means reporting order. It doesn't mean anything other than they put it in that order.
So Martin Bates from Park City is saying, now these size effects, can they, in this case, represent time in years? So I'm not sure what that means, but
So this is an average. Again, as we were doing a gap analysis, what we wanted to see was, can we identify a, a time or a trend that the gap was actually increasing or decreasing? We had to bring into account too that we change from assessment to assessment at different times, and so we can go and look at that. There's basically a line drawn between the 2013 2014 year when we moved from the CRTs to the SAGE data. So we did see a change inside of there, or a decrease in the gap, but it is still, for example, looking at English learners, a 2.7 in 2008, and you go to 2009, it's a 2.3. If you look at just through 2008 through 2015, 13, it averages at the 2.8, 2.9. As we jump to the 2014 forward, it does decrease a little bit by 2.5, and that's the consistent average all the way across. A slight decrease as we get to 2019. So we do see some movement here, but for the most part, it has maintained the same large effect size um, over 12 years. Does that help answer the question?
Yeah, I mean, I get that it's a big effect size, but I was thinking, okay, if this, where it's over a 12-year span, I was wondering if we could realistically translate that into, okay, so if 2.7, could that then mean, okay, by the end of those 12 years, are they then 2.7 years behind? But totally unrelated, correct?
Yeah.
Gotcha. Thanks, Aaron.
Thank you.
So there's another question from Whitney, who does know statistics quite well, and she says, could you find the effect size on, for an LEA or a school by using a linear, hierarchical linear modeling? So each LEA and each school would actually better understand, because many people understand the effect size. But my question is not so much to identify the gaps, which I think is important. But the other question is, when you do that kind of work, then you can actually see which student groups, um, you know, based on the small gap and the medium and the high.
Yeah.
So that's the other thing that you could do. So is that actually
So
using?
what, yeah, so what Whitney's talking about is when you use a hierarchical linear model, what you're doing is you're encapsulating the statistics with other variables, or it's a hierarchy linear modeling, hence the name, is where you embed both the concept that the students belong to both a school and to a district, and then you track that over time. The answer is yes, you can do that, and you can start tracking the effect size, but the effect size of just the performance then gets compounded within the ability of the schools. And just sharing back to Whitney, we did discuss doing some modeling inside of the HLM component in presentation to the board. It takes more time to set up those models. And these are things to look at definitely. As we approached the research or the statistics on this one, in particular, because it was a 12-year study, and we were going across different assessments. Things start breaking apart when you do assessment to assessment comparison, and so we'd have to go back in and code for that very carefully. And that has, just sharing, is it's run into other problems that people way smarter than I am have run into and not been able to solve as they try to do a mapping study between one assessment into another assessment. But anyway, long story short is yes, there's other ways to look at this. Go ahead.
So Aaron, another question is, and actually you've kind of addressed it in your last comment. It says, how did the analysis control for whether the effect difference was based on bias in a test as opposed to real differences in student knowledge? I think you've already answered this question, but you want to talk about,
You bet.
talking, yeah, about the change from, that's part of the issue. It's we don't have the common assessment throughout those 12 years.
Correct. That's part of the issue. Just know that one, the assessment department always runs a bias and sensitivity review on each assessment contract that they have. So be it CRT, be it the RISE, Utah Aspire Plus and such, there is a bias and sensitivity process that the assessment goes through that tries to clean that up as best as it can be done. The very best, and just this is assessment theory, or the very best assessment means a student on day one can go in and take the test, and then another day shortly after that could take the test again, and it would give you the basically the same results. It wouldn't matter if the kid was having a good day or a bad day, and the other variables within the student's life can be coded for. That's incredibly difficult to do. So, is there some bias inside of here? It can't be totally removed. It is reviewed and checked um, at great lengths. Um,
Yeah, I think Megan is saying that data validation, after to ensure items are not performing in a biased way. So that's another indicator. And then Whitney is saying, is this referring to test equating, not bias? So I think
it's,
it's actually bias.
yeah, it's not the equating.
Right.
Yeah.
So I've actually been on those reviews when I was in secondary language arts as well, and when we did our original, I think it was 10 years ago or 11, I can't remember which, uh, and so if you look at the actual criteria related to determining items, each item has a particular bias and the impact it has on students from different groups. You'll see that it's a very rigorous way, especially if you have on that approach related to diverse perspectives with people looking at that. So this is a really important question. And one of the reasons it's an important question is oftentimes when you present data to teachers, they'll instantly go to, well, this is a test that's prejudice against our students or whatever. So the more knowledgeable you are about the actual practices to control for bias is really important for you to discuss related to what happens in when you get your student data back and when you're working in professional learning communities. So at the district level, it's really important, and we can talk offline about this with Aaron at another time, and not even with Aaron because I know he's extremely busy. But these issues are really important, and I think the issue that you have to think about is what are the implications and the impact on our um, teachers in relation to helping them better understand how they adjust instruction by using student information that is beneficial. One of the best student support protocols I've ever seen that does that is Weber School District. Um, and I hope to get them doing a webinar so you can better understand the way in which that happens. They start with descriptive analysis of students' interactions with other students and with teachers and their interactions with the family. It's never ever judgmental, it's just descriptive. And they start with that in the beginning before they even go to any kind of statistical data. Um, so this piece is really critical in the way in which we support the mind, the ability to get unstuck in the way they think about certain students. So the work that we're doing is incredibly critical, and I'm hoping that it's going to help you better understand how you develop relationships with teachers so that they develop relationships with students and families, without kind of the way that they typically think about specific students. And Davis has done a really good job of this in relationship to changing the way counseling happens, because they act, and he and John Zerbakken actually did a webinar for us, and it's on our playlist, because their graduation rate for multilingual learners is 93%, and that's connected to the 95% of their other students of the standard. So I'm saying this so that you can realize the relevant implications in your actual practice with principals and teachers using this kind of data.
yeah.
Okay, so we don't have any more questions. Do you want to go on, Aaron?
Okay. Yeah. And again, these are fantastic questions and obviously wonderful comments that Christelle is making and the point behind all this. Let's just reflect to the point or the main question that this study was guided under was, can we find empirical evidence inside of Utah that there is a disparity? Um, And so that's what we went after. Um, Again, just sharing this, the data that we're presenting is designed to answer that question. And there's multiple ways to go and put um, research together. So just sharing, again, reason why the data are the way they are. Um, we looked, so moving forward, we looked at um, the numbers from that 12-year study, and then it was, let's refine this a little bit. And so we identified, or we looked at, what is the risk factors of a student being in poverty, or being in special ed, or a student who is a multilingual learner. Um, and so we removed that group, or anyone who fell within those additional risk factors, out. And then we just wanted to look at students who identified as white and are not identified as social emotional status, or students with disability, or English learners, and also students who identified as one of the main race ethnicities that we track here in Utah. And so we removed, again, all the risk factors, or those additional risk factors, and just want to say students who are given should be the same in performance. Because we've removed the risk factors, are we seeing a gap in their performance? And so that's what we did, and we limited it down just to the SAGE and the RISE data. So what did we find? So again, the white students are going to be 0 all the way across, because that's the group. It's the largest group, but it's the one that we zeroed against, or meaning that was the comparison for this effect size study. So as you can see, the Asians in language arts was a 0.5 to a 1.1 above. Again, this has removed all the risk factors from them, comparing to the students of the same status. Then we looked at the multiple race. Then we looked at the Hispanic, and then the African American, the Pacific Islanders, and the American Indians. And as you can see through here, again, this is a 6-year. We can see from year to year, are the trends moving back and forth, what's happening inside of there. We can see, for example, the African American had a decrease from a 1.9 to a 1.4. Looked like a steady decrease, or enough that looked like we were making some progress. The Pacific Islander was a little alarming, where it went from 1.2 to 1.8. And then the American Indians was a -2, was decreased all the way up to a 1.3, and then it dropped to a -2 again. We don't know if that -2 was anomaly in that year, or what was going on. So again, you can see, one is we want to look at the trend. Are things moving? So for, again, Latino, it's pretty stable from year to year to year. Little concerned about what's going on with the Pacific Islanders. The American Indian was moving in a good direction. And again, and then, as you know, we lost our 2020 assessment window because of the pandemic, and we'll be getting 2021 in here, which may be a new baseline where we have to start everything all over again. Don't know for sure, but this historically tells us what's going on with language arts. Moving over to math, similar trends. Again, the Asian Americans are a little bit higher. And interestingly, something happened in 2019 where they dropped. Multiple races are getting pretty close to what the base, or the white group is. Again, Hispanics decreasing in that gap. It's still large. Again, looking at the African Americans, there appears to be a trend to decrease that gap. Again, on the Pacific Islanders, that's reversed. And the Native Americans population likewise had the exact same decrease, but then in 2019, there was a marked increase in that again. Looking then finally at science, you can see that interestingly, the Asian Americans flipped. And that's not a small transition. That's a large transition. Again, these are effect size numbers that we're looking at. Interesting question, what's going on there with the Asian student group? Multiple races are doing very well. The Hispanic group shows a continued decrease of that gap that we saw inside of there. It's still, it is a significant or large gap. The African Americans, something happened in 2019, which hope, that's a good trend there. Where again, is that a trend, an anomaly? What's going on? We're not sure. Kind of an interesting results that we saw in that last year. Pacific Islanders, in this case, though, actually began to decrease on that gap. Again, we saw a trend for the Native Americans, a decrease, but in 2019, something happened where that gap then jumped back up and that effect size became just large. So these are things that are worrisome as we're looking at saying, what is going on between how the students are performing over trend lines and such. Again, looking at this, we took the 6 years and we averaged them out. So this does then mask that year-to-year trend and kind of give you, okay, on average, where are they at in this new assessment that we've been administering. Any questions on those? Go back and
yeah, so I think one observation is, a deep appreciation for the work that your entire team did on this and the potential opportunities for us to use this and adapt it and work with district leaders to better understand, the way in which patterns and trends can be used in a very concrete way related to learning more about who the students are and what they need in relationship to high quality instruction. So, the work that you've done is, I think, really important. And to translate it practically into the actual work of districts, assessment people, as well as schools, I think is really important. I think it's in August, we're going to have Granite, who's done a really good job in looking at annual growth goals and trends, and then made it really accessible to their principals, and then connected to the work they do in PLCs. So that will be a follow-up that will answer some of your questions related to how does statewide equity data give us a hint about what we should be looking at in relationship to the work that we do with multilingual learners and other student groups, obviously, because a targeted school improvement, does identify schools that are in that lowest 5% by student group academically. So, thanks, Aaron. And I think we can probably go on. I just see kudos to you from Whitney and other people.
Well, thank you. And again, just sharing back, these numbers are large. We have basically 1.3 million records that we're using over the 6 years of student data to really give us a good statewide perspective of what are we seeing. So the numbers aren't inconsequential in what we're seeing. I mean, they're hard to move at a state level, absolutely. The good news is these are much easier to adjust in effect when you're working within a school. Moving forward, we're going to look at the graduation rates. Again, we just wanted to highlight, are we seeing trends through the years. We looked at, in this graph, we looked at the 2013 compared to the 2020 school year. Did we see decreases or increases? Everyone increased. And so while the state is getting better, and sometimes that can be attributed just to better data quality, data submission, better record keeping, which increases, does increase the rate. We also can see that each one of those groups did increase. Did one outstretch the other? It didn't appear to be one that was a gap was closing inside of here. But an overall improvement, which is fantastic to see inside of here. Moving on, we looked at the IGP. And so the Intergenerational Poverty Initiative focused on education, early childhood development, family economic stability, and health. This is an annual report that is posted. It's up on the it's the Department of Workforce Services that puts that out there, and that's the link to that report. As we looked at this, the following slides show that from kindergarten through graduation, students experiencing intergenerational poverty have substantially worse outcomes compared to the state overall population. And so as we looked at this, the first one was the keep entry and exit profiles, where we said, let's look at all students and look at those students identified as IGP, or again, the intergenerational poverty and the overall outcomes that we would see inside of here. So again, here's your literacy and your numeracy on keep and the difference between the two groups. As we look at the content test, so this is your standardized test that we were looking at just before the SAGE data. You can see the third grade and the math grade. There is a substantial gap inside of here. Now, these gaps that we're showing, these are actually just the percentages. We did not have time to run through and actually calculate the effect size on it, but knowing how the effect size calculations work, the guess is it's fairly large.
So, Aaron, we have a question from Brian Yazzie who says, are we able to disaggregate the data within ethnic groups or student groups? The data can be misleading by looking at it as an aggregate,
right,
for the intergenerational poverty.
And we haven't. And the reason why we haven't is because the N size is so small. That's a great question. Primarily what we've done is just focus on the intergenerational poverty identifier in and of itself. And it's a super protected class. And so we haven't done that additional study. So that's a great point. Should we be looking at that? What you'll find is it's going to mirror the same statistics of the, when I say it mirrors, it is almost identical with a little bit higher hit on the Hispanic group, from what you'll see from, if you took just basically the entire population and looked at those who are low income, and then look at the student groups or the race ethnicity of those student groups. It's a very similar model to that. But in these reports that we did, we didn't go down to that level. Good question. No, we didn't do it. Could it be dropped even further? Yes, it could. But again, we're dealing with a very sensitive group on those end sizes. So great question.
Yeah, so let me just add something, which so whenever I look at data like this, I don't necessarily do interpretations, but I always do implications. So what would be the implications of the data that we're looking at for intergenerational poverty? Now, the use of the idea of risk factors is used to actually identify, right, a specific group. But the real question ends up being, what are the conditions that have been created that this experience for children goes through generation? And so one of the most important issues is related to how we better understand the families and communities that we are serving without the kinds of judgments that end up mitigating or end up kind of exacerbating, uh, these trends. So if you think about the work that I've heard being done with Cheryl Ellsworth, and this happens at Weber, and I'm saying this because I actually saw it in action in a student services group, about the relationship and the engagement of parents in the life of their children's educational experiences. So this is a way to think differently about what actually happens, especially, before they take the keep, and all the research related to stress and toxic stress related to issues of poverty and conditions that have been really exacerbated since COVID. So we'll talk about that in relationship to what's happening in really interesting places during the summer school, and then looking at how that has an impact. And this is, we have to really be indebted to the way in which the questions have been asked and the data indicators are being used to help us think about the implications for our own work. So again, that's just my commentary related to the implications.
Thank you. Moving on, looking at this again. So this is the ACT composite benchmark scores. Again, so high school students. Again, intergenerational poverty definitely has having an impact on that student group and how well they're performing against their peers. As we look at other completers, for example, on the cohort graduation, you can see that the graduates, it's a little bit below, the dropouts a little bit higher, but then we look at the other completers, these students of the retained seniors, there's a high percentage of these students who are going on who need some additional help. So as we look look at this one right here, it says your other completers. Of those other completers, 10% of them were an IGP student group. So we looked at the summary of program participation, what programs were really having an impact or had a large percentage of IGP students participating. We looked at the early literacy programs, the optional enhanced kindergarten, and the Title I wide school program, and who it was targeted towards. And you can see where that blue line's at, saying of those who are intergenerational poverty, that percentage of 61, the 46, and the 40% of students who were intergenerational poverty were in one of those three programs, and then it falls off dramatically. So it's kind of just an interesting review as you look at this, saying sometimes like the IGP after school program, for example, that one's kind of tricky because of the way the data sets are allowed to be shared. Is actually we can't identify directly to the LEAs, to you, who an IGP student is. And so sometimes it's very difficult to say, well, this program is intended to help, but not always is it getting to that group. But again, going back to this, we can say, yes, the early literacy programs, the enhanced kindergarten, and the Title I program seem to have those programs that have the greatest involvement.
So could you go back and leave that up for a minute?
Yeah.
So this is just a rhetorical question, so I don't expect anybody to put anything in the chat. But what do you notice about the relationship of retention practices and district policies related to who teaches in which schools? So that's all I'm going to say, because that goes back to the issue of policy and the way in which administrators are transferred from school to school, and the way teachers, related to either their preferences or what they consider burnout, and the culture of the schools where intergenerational participation in poverty ends up being a factor. So that's all I'm going to say.
Okay, thank you. Student experience. As we start looking at identification of students with disabilities, statewide, overall, there's not a problem with disproportionality in students in a particular race, ethnicity being identified as a student with disability. These are federal requirements where we have risk ratios go through in calculation, and if any district has a high indicator, they are flagged and reviewed. And so the risk ratios are used to measure the degree in which students in racial ethnic groups are overrepresented or underrepresented as being identified as a student with disability. A risk ratio of 0.5 means the students from a particular race group are half as likely to be identified. A risk ratio of 1 means the students from a particular racial group are likely to be identified as students with disabilities from all other racials. So basically, it's equal. A risk ratio of 2 means that students from a particular race, ethnicity are twice as likely to be identified. And a risk ratio of 3 is flagged as being a disproportionality. And so as we look at this, we look at the Asians, the American Indians, the Black, African American, Pacific Islanders, Hispanic, multiple race, and white. So this is for the year 2020. Little high on a couple of them, but no one got to the high risk that needed to be flagged. As we look at this, we look at that the areas in which the identifications happen. Again, a lot of the special ed team works on this and they review this very, very closely. And you can see that the African Americans in the emotional disturbance did get a little bit higher than 3 in that one particular area of identification. And so it's being reviewed and looked at by the special ed group. But you can see kind of that distribution of, are they being identified somewhere more than another, and why? And so again, if they have a ratio that's too high, it's identified and then worked upon with the special ed group.
So Aaron, I'll just say something about that, because I'm now thinking that the kind of social, larger society climate that we're in at the moment, and this is from really amazing work that Harvard has done on, toxic stress and its relationship to student anxiety, and then the way in which certain students, not even student groups, respond to the kind of stressful environment that the adults actually have created, and not really understanding the implications on mental health for children or their families. And I'm bringing this up because of the issue related to the impact of COVID, and the impact of the pandemic on essential workers and economic opportunity, because the gaps economically are getting larger for certain groups, and specifically women who had previously worked, and for also specific ethnic groups. So I just want to bring that up so that we can better understand the work related to anxiety and toxic stress and the implications for the actual work that we do. And I think a lot of the next work that Aaron has done is going to help us get a better insight into that.
Okay, thank you. Again, this just kind of does a comparison of the percentages of students who are IGP within the district, but the number of students who are IGP and identified as special ed versus the percentage of all students in special ed themselves, where the IGP group is overly identified, or there's a higher percentage of that group. Again, additional resources and investigation are ongoing in this process. So we start talking about student experience with incidents and such. So as we look at the incident level reporting, each year the LEAs all submit required discipline incident data to the state. These infraction data comes in the four main categories: weapons, violence, alcohol, tobacco, or other. We've been working to improve this data collection. As a result of these efforts, a larger increase has been reported in the 2017-18, 18-19 school year. It's believed that incident data is still underreported. So that's kind of important to note. The counts are expected to continue to increase. And it's not because we think more incidences are happening. It's because we think we're trying to get a better or a more accurate picture of what's going on with incidents within the school. So that's kind of an important note as we start looking at this information. By the way, the last year with the shutdown, our incident rates just dropped off. The assumption is because everyone worked at home. So just sharing is, things are obviously in flux, and the pandemic has all kinds of ramification as we start looking at the data. So as we look at this, obviously, yes, we are seeing a percentage of LEAs reporting incidents. We do see the increase, but that increase really has to do is we're trying to make sure that we're getting a better picture of what's going on inside of there. So the increase doesn't mean that there is an increase in incidents within the school. We believe it's a better reporting, and those numbers are just kind of, as you see, side by side share how that's increasing. So again, in 2020, we had 97% of the LEAs reporting incidents, where back in 2017, we only had half that were reporting it. So again, numbers are increasing, but we believe this is still an underreported amount. So as we look at this incident data across student demographics, special ed, economic disadvantage, and English learners, regular education group, about 37% of them are identified inside of there. Of the special ed, it's when I say 3.7, and then a 6.5 are special ed. Not economically disadvantaged is 2.8, where the economic disadvantage has a 6.7, and the English learners has a 5.6% versus those who are non, a 3.9. So there's a higher incident identification happening with these three student groups as we look at them. And as we look at students with one or more incident by race and ethnicity, the Native Americans, the percentage is almost 10, or 1 in 10. The African Americans, it's 7.2, and then you see the Asians down at the bottom at 2.3. So students with one or more incidents by the demographic groups, economic disadvantage being the highest at 6.7, special ed, English learners, all students, native and fluent English speakers, regular education, and then non-economic disadvantage group. And you can just kind of see how that spread is there.
Yeah, so I'll add. So are you doing more discipline data? Because then I'll make my comment after.
Yeah, this is the last one, and then we'll jump into the sharp data. So students identified as English learners make up about 9% of student population, but it makes up about 14% of all the discipline. So there is a disproportionate amount of these students who are being referred to the police or in school suspension, out of school suspension, expulsion, and then just comparing that to the percentage of the total enrollment. So go ahead.
Yeah, so I think this chart is a really important one when you look at the percent of enrollment, which is, generally, as you said, 9%. But then you look at the discipline referrals, and the kinds of referrals uh, are related to a really critical issue that is embedded in the way in which the culture of each school shapes whether students actually feel welcomed and comfortable uh, and accepted. So, this really points to this idea of what a learning community is, what that looks like for individual students who are different than typically the teaching staff, and the way in which those families are welcomed in a language that actually supports the way in which they're welcomed into a community of learners. So these data, again, I always think about the implications for us in our practice and the policies and behaviors that we use to create a true learning community for each individual student and their families and communities. So I think Betty Jimenez is saying, how could 2020 be that high with the pandemic?
It's not saying that 36% of the ELs um, were given an expulsion. It means of the expulsions that were given out during the 2020, 36% of them were EL. Again, the numbers are increasing. So, and again, those N sizes are fairly small. Um, and it's changed into a percentage to say of this population, what kind of percentage are they over or underrepresented in these type of discipline. That's what does. Hopefully that makes sense. So we're not saying there were so many these expulsions. What we're saying is of the expulsions that happened in 2020, uh, quite high percentage of those were English learners.
So Thais from Ogden she has a question. Says, do we have this behavior data broken down to see how much is other versus weapon, violent, and alcohol?
Yes, in other reports we do have it. Again, the point of this slide was actually to highlight or display, is there a disproportionate impact happening with students of either EL, special ed, low income, or the race ethnicity. So yes, we have other reports that go into the numbers, what's going on inside of there. And in addition to that, the general feel that the numbers are underreported, but are getting better. So again, 2020 was a weird year. The numbers did increase. We had almost 100% of the EALs, or sorry, the LEAs reporting data. We don't think it's a perfect picture behind there. So things may clear up as the data get better, but this is just the trend and what it's showing.
Thanks, Aaron.
Okay. Sharp data. So it's the student health and risk prevention. I assume most of you are familiar with this. It's administered every other year by the Department of Human Services. It's the 6th, 8th, 10th, and 12th grades that take this. And just looking at this, again, it's the intent is to say, are we seeing some disproportionality happening inside of here? Again, these are the N sizes or the number of respondents that we have by the grades, and you just see the general numbers there. So it's not an entire population of Utah, obviously. And this just kind of goes through which do you identify as for gender, transgender, other, For example, so we just have those numbers. So as we look at those, is if you've been bullied in the past 12 years, why do you think you were bullied? And it's kind of interesting when you look at this white compared to all other races. Uh, do whites believe that they were bullied because of their color? No. Other races, much more so. Others, some other reason was higher, the way I look or my sexual orientation. But if you look, for example, at the Black African American versus the other races, do they feel like they're being bullied because of the color of their skin? And the answer is they definitely do. Um, a very different experience um, that is having, especially by that group.
So I'll just add this implication. If you actually think about the data on discipline and the consequences for African Americans and the level of toxic stress, just based on their perceptions related to how they're treated by the color of their skin, then we have some really important work to do, as well as this whole idea about appearances. The way in which I'm thinking people are looking at me because of the way I dress or the way I look. So I'm always looking at data in relationship to the actual experience of the learner in a culture of a school that somehow does not see that this is happening, right? So for me, that's the biggest issue. And then the question is, so what are we all going to do about it? And that's a rhetorical question, and one that you have to take into your heart and better understand the relationship between family engagement, the culture of the school as welcoming and belonging, and then the impact it actually has on individual students, and not just their academic achievement, but how they become contributing citizens to their community, their family, and their neighborhood. So I always go there um, because I think we have the greatest opportunity as educators to really look at those issues. Thanks, Aaron.
Yeah. No, and the truth is this actually is an incredibly important um, slide for the general public. When I say the general public, I mean, the majority of Utah is white, and just do not see um, the color of their skin being a factor. Where the perception, as you were just saying, is very different from those who come from different backgrounds, especially the Black African American student group who are telling us a very different pitch story behind this, and one that we need to pay attention to. Okay, how safe do you feel in each of the following areas of your school? Um, percent who felt unsafe, white versus all other races, in the parking lots, the bathrooms, and the buses. And then if you start looking at the African American on those, the parking lots, the bathrooms, and the buses. So as you look at this, this would be a wonderful policy discussion within the school, looking at this information saying, wait a minute, if the African American group is feeling unsafe or felt unsafe in the parking lot, so much more so, what are we doing? Do we actually have individuals out there during that time or not? It's kind of an interesting look at, again, what are our policies in place and what are we seeing here? How worried, if at all, are you about the possibility of each of the following things happening at your school? Gun violence, suicide by a student, and student using alcohol or drugs. Again, we're looking at the whites, and then we're looking at the African American and the other races. Gun violence, that's a stark difference. Suicide by student, it's similar in N sizes that are kind of interesting, or percentages, but again, a different perspective. Social emotional learning. In this final one, we presented to them really is this the new constructs of social emotional learning that a number of LEAs are implementing. This one in particular, we use the early warning system components. This does come from Ogden. From the data that I reached out to the Ogden School District, said, can I utilize this for this evaluation? So we looked at these constructs, the number of strengths, self-efficacy, grit, self-management, social awareness, sense of belonging, classroom effort, emotional regulation, engagement, learning strategies, social perspective, talking, and returning to school were the constructs that they measured. This just kind of gives a view of the dashboard and how it works that the district has been working on, and how they can drill in on an individual student and see where they're filling in these different constructs. So we took the data and we looked at it, and we just basically charted out saying, what were the number of strengths that you're identified, or you felt you identified with, and the average was basically around 5, as they thought of all the social emotional strengths they have. And so as we started looking at this, though, we said, okay, let's look at, and again, I apologize for the codes inside of here, but for the economically disadvantaged, that we did see that there tends to be a higher value for the social, for those who feel that they have more strengths if they're more well-to-do. And if they're less well-to-do or are in the low income, they feel like they have fewer strengths. Self-efficacy construct as how much a student believes they can succeed in achieving academic outcomes. And as a result of the self-efficacy, had a very strong correlation with the other social emotional learning constructs. So we use this, the self-efficacy, as an overall proxy to evaluate the impact of social emotional learning experience in relation to the students' demographic groups. So again, as we looked at this, those.
So, Aaron, can I say one thing? So I'm going to say two things. The first thing is this idea of a growth mindset, right? The way in which school environments create growth mindsets that we're all growing together, so that perceptions of students and their self-perceptions have a better chance with the conditions that we've created in the classroom. The other thing is the resiliency indicators related to protective factors aligns with this idea of self-efficacy in relationship to what we can do to better create those conditions for students to actually change their perceptions. And basically, it's, the way in which perception happen. A student thinks someone is thinking something about them. They walk into a classroom, and as soon as I was a high school teacher, and a teacher, in 4th grade all the way up to seniors. They walk into a classroom, they look around, and they end up sensing, based on their conditioned experiences, what other people are thinking about them, what other people are looking at them based on their appearances. So this whole idea of the growth mindset in creating that environment, which I've seen lots of schools do when they focus on that, changes the way in which students are now thinking about themselves and their own self-efficacy.
Yeah.
Thanks, Aaron.
Yeah. And really what this chart is telling us is those students who are not in the the economic disadvantage status tend to have a higher self-efficacy than those who are in the low income. And it has the effect size in there, the Cohen's of 0.286. So the effect is there. It's, again, for this group, it's small, but it's definitely there. This takes us back, again, just sharing, these are the numbers of data that we went through and we wanted to share. As I talked with Christelle, thought that these are important. But really, we want to come back to the point of a gap analysis. Um, are there evidences that suggest that there are barriers to high quality learning opportunities? Um, and the improving outcomes among the different demographic students that we track. This is the question that each of us are asking as we go through this. And then we really need to take it back to those three policy questions or three key questions. What policies, again, practices, what have you, are there to reduce the barriers? Are we following through on those and have evidence to suggest that those policies are effective? That's the next part of it. And then finally, how can we increase the quality education opportunity for all the students? And so that, again, the point of this exercise is what can we do um, to focus on this? And really that goes back to the practitioners and the fantastic work that Christelle and you are working on. That's the end of this part of the presentation. And so I'm going to stop sharing.
So we have some questions. So this is Michelle Eldridge from Provo, and she's saying, what groups of educators across the state has this data been presented to? Which, you know, Michelle is really, she's really on it, and she's asking really good questions. So why don't you respond, and then I'll kind of make a comment.
Okay, so the answer is we presented this to the Standards and Assessment Committee at the Board of Education back in, I don't remember when it was. It was just within the last few months. I don't remember the time because I've just been busy the whole time anyway. It was presented to them. Frankly, it wasn't well received. And that's my estimation of how well it was received. Maybe it was well received. The just feedback through the time restraints that we had could be a factor behind those. But I'm just letting you know, as we went through it, it's like, that was kind of an interesting response reaction. Other
Yes.
groups that have looked at this at a state level really have to do with the Technical Advisory Committee, and then you guys is who I have shared or presented this information to. So far, that's it.
Yeah, so let me, so I'm going to jump in here and try to be as positive as possible. So we have lots of questions about this. It says university not well received or by a few. Why do you think not well received? So I'll just give you kind of my perceptions, because I actually was at that meeting when it was presented. That's why I was so impressed. Because my mind goes to implications. I'm just like a really incredibly pragmatic person, you know, and I've worked and am dedicated to students and their families and the outcomes and the honorable profession of teaching, which pretty much right now is our only hope for lots of reasons that I won't go into, as well as policy and practices and changing the heart in relationship to our conditioned experiences and the way we think about the world. So there's a really interesting dynamic that goes on. And one dynamic is, you know, it's the individual student's responsibility and their families, and they have to work hard and pull themselves up by their bootstraps, right? So, and fit into a system, to be enculturated into a system that already exists with certain advantages for certain groups. Now, there's nothing innately wrong about that, other than in the long term, it doesn't really help an increasingly more diverse planet or more diverse Utah. It just does not help. This argument happened in the 60s, And then in the 90s, when a research study with Stanford, Milbury McLaughlin, said that, and this was a huge sample size in 1993 that I spent lots of my time working on with colleagues at the Annenberg Institute. They went to high schools and they looked at each department in the high school by content area, and they identified 3 patterns of teachers' responses to increasingly diverse populations. The first response was, and their underlying assumption was the impact of poverty would be, and their parents' socioeconomic status would be the indicator of achievement, student achievement. That was their underlying assumption. But that didn't happen. They went in and they found patterns of practices with 3 patterns. And the first pattern was when teachers actually in schools got students who were diverse, a teacher's response was, well, I'm not going to lower my standards. And so the outcome for achievement obviously was no achievement. No achievement for the student and burnout for the teacher. The second pattern they found was, when diverse students came in, these poor students. So, I'm going to not ask them to do the same thing that I'm asking kind of the students that I'm used to working with, those poor students. So teacher burnout, because they didn't actually see the results, was very high, and there was no student achievement because the students obviously understood. And I actually heard this from students, high school students, when I did focus groups in Utah, when a teacher will come over to them and say, well, you can actually do something different because this might be too hard for you. I know this is actually hard to believe that this happens. Then they found this really aberrant group. This group was a group that ended up, when they saw an increase in diverse students and felt at a loss, they ended up meeting together and getting feedback and observing classrooms. And that's how the professional learning community research is actually based on this early research at Stanford to actually change the practices. And as you know, Hattie is very clear in relationship to the highest effect size for an annual growth, which is what? Collective efficacy, right, of teachers working together. So I'm just saying that there are these really interesting ongoing polarizing conversations that we have to be really strategic about. So that's why I identified high schools that were actually closing the opportunity gap, right? That's why I took high poverty schools and identified schools that were making huge gains with kids becoming English proficient. Because when we did another study, and Aaron helped me on this quite a few years ago, we looked at course-taking patterns, and we've done that previously, of who is in rigorous courses, honors classes, concurrent courses, and we have that data on the student report card. So you should be looking at that for every single school that you're working with in relationship to the student groups who have access, equitable access to post-secondary preparation. I mean, that ends up being one of the ways that we can mitigate these gaps and encourage people. And actually, a board member said this, because they're not, in some ways, there's this ideology about, these poor schools get all this money and they're not doing well anyway. And so how come that money isn't given equally to all schools, no matter what the racial makeup is? So this is a current thing that's going on. And when I was in Salt Lake, it was a similar thing related to the East Side schools and the West Side schools, who felt that the West Side schools were getting more resources and they were more privileged because they were poor. So ultimately the question ends up being, and I'm going to look at other things. So someone is saying we need to have you share this with the Title I directors. I actually invited the Title I directors too. But the original question is, how do we disseminate this in a way, and this is what Aaron and I always talk about, that actually has an impact on individual schools, LEAs, and principals related to what's happening in schools, right? Because oftentimes the data used is not used in a very pragmatic way. People dismiss it based on, oh, well, that's that family, or, that student or that group, whatever. So one question is, so Megan says it seems very sobering information, may not be easy to digest by all, but that's just my perspective from having addressed the crucial conversations to implement change and have some serious self-reflection. Some educators I have worked with have a hard time placing themselves in the conversation of responsibility. Well, while I agree with that, I think that's really, in some ways, besides the point, because that's actually our job. As a teacher, and this is what John Zerbakken said, it's all about relationships with individual students and the way in which you create environments in which we were all learning from each other. And there are teachers who do this all the time. They get feedback from their students, they adjust their instruction, without being threatened and self-defensive and feeling people are being accused of being incompetent.
Christelle,
Let me just do one more thing, and then we can look at the other questions. So Michelle Eldridge is saying, was this presentation connected to the loud recent political CRT community voices? Critical race theory, by the way, if you don't know what that means. So was that connected to, I don't really think it was, but you can say if you think it was.
I'll go and kind of answer to my comments behind it. The thing that was interesting about this research request or information request from the board, of the 17 years that I have worked for the board, this is the first time I know of where there was a concerted effort between multiple sections to identify, is there a disparity happening here inside of Utah? We've always disaggregated the reports by the different groups and shared those, but this seemed to be the first time that the board actually took focused attention to, is there something going on here or not? It was before the CRT community concerns started popping up. To my knowledge, I hadn't heard of the critical race theory component until after we did this presentation. But again, this is the first time we presented it. So it was one, fascinating because it was a lot of work by multiple sections. And as we got together from the multiple sections to present our findings, we found a repeating pattern again and again and again in every element that we looked at. Was there a disproportional influence happening based upon race? Yes. Did we see evidence that the ELs, the special ed or the low income students were also underperforming? The answer was yes, we saw it through multiple areas. We didn't look just at the academic performance. Again, we looked at participation in different things. We looked at their social emotional learning. We looked at, like we said, we looked at their SHARP data, and we presented all of it as saying, answering the question, are there evidences? And the answer was, yes, we found evidences, and it was clear. When I say it wasn't well received, again, we weren't dealing with a very large group. This is the standards and assessment. There's 4 members who sit on that group. There are other people, I think, who voiced some opinion or shared at the time. And the reason why I say I don't think it was received well is they asked a very specific question, and then as we presented the very specific answer, it got diverted. And we started to go down, if you will, different rabbit holes or different areas that just didn't respond to the question. And that was a little frustrating, again, just sharing on my part, where it's like, you asked the question, we gave you the answer, but they didn't want to look at the answer. And again, I don't know if it was a time constraint issue that they had, if they had already read through the report and they were done and they wanted to move on. So there's factors inside of there I just don't know. I'm just sharing with you my perception. Others, though, have definitely reached out. And when I say others, especially educators who were looking at this, Christelle, for one, really took an interest in, let me see what's going on. Let's discuss this, go a little bit deeper into it. So just sharing as we presented that information, again, bringing into the fact that this was an open meeting with the state board, elected officials, with a time constraint that we had to get through a lot of information. We presented this to you, and let's see, we've been doing this for about an hour and 46 minutes. We had 30 minutes to present the whole thing to them. So just sharing the impact or the difference between the way we were able to present it. And so I have to bring in those other variables as possible reasons why it's was that received well. Frustration. I'm sure most of you, if not all of you, have been in a situation where you've been asked to answer a question, you present it, and you just don't have enough time to present all the information, the background that you were able to present at the time, and you wish you could have done it better. So it might be personal feelings, inadequacy of be able to summarize in a very quick manner or not, but just sharing my experience and my feelings as we presented it. So
Yeah, so I'm checking to see if there are other questions. One of the reasons Aaron and I designed it this way for and invited all of you, as well as all the resettlement agency people and multiple principals, and we wanted to share it with as many people as we could, is that we wanted you to start thinking about the practical implications in the kinds of inquiry questions that you ask and the sets of data that will help you better understand how you evaluate program effectiveness. You can't keep spending money the same way and resources, and then we have the same outcomes for our student groups. Okay, and that's on us, right? So the whole way, and if you need help on this, I'm always available, and I have a little practice doing this, you know, and I've seen amazing practices all over the state with commendations for exceptional teachers, and then for me the question becomes, why over 12 years are we seeing the same patterns, right? I mean, this is like our job, and it's a privilege to do it. And anytime you need any kind of support, and I really encourage you to go to our Promising Practices playlist to actually see and hear how policies and practices are being changed, much to some people's discontent, for equitable access to an economic future that depends on the education of our students, right? And really addressing the conditions in a systemic way. I mean, that's really the point. So if you have no more questions, I just want to say that that Aaron and I, we've been friends for a long time and intellectual colleagues. And so the kinds of questions that we're interested in and the practicality of using data to actually make a difference for what happens in schools and for all of our children, is really, really important to us. And I know it's important to you. That's why I wanted you to be involved, and I wanted to provide this for all of you to think, in really creative and innovative ways. And I'll end with one simple story. So, because I always like to end up on a positive note here. So because of Zoom, I actually had the opportunity to teach a humanities course to students in East High, multilingual learners, and at Utah International School. The humanities course was a kind of a Stanford model with dialogue. And so we had one student who did his presentation, and another student that's coming up, and he started with an interest of his, which was like aerodynamics and, you know, planes and stuff like that. And then he ended up switching it because that's the way learning happens based on interests. He was in the Democratic Republic of the Congo after his family escaped the Rwanda genocide. And so about a month ago, he said, well, so I saw this and I'm really interested in, so I want to change my topic to find out the experiences of the Rwanda genocide on my family because they never talk about it. That's one example. Another example is I met a student who had just come from Guatemala and had some, she's an asylee. And in our conversations, she had some worries about being able to get into a university because of, you know, the issues related to her, not her status necessarily, but economics and that. So she, among other students with who are multilingual learners, students who, you know, English is their sixth language, and they applied for the First Ascent Scholars, which is a 4-year scholarship at the Eccles Business School. And both of them, this one girl from Guatemala got a second interview. She got a first interview, worked really hard on her essay, then got a second interview, and the university said, well, you've only been in the country for not totally a year, so you have to pass the TESOL exam to show that you're English proficient. Okay, so she took the exam, and then she missed it by 10 points. Then she took another exam. She passed it. When she passed it, she was accepted into the University of Utah, but at a higher rate because she was considered an out-of-state, an out-of-country person. And so the Eccles Business School actually ended up paying the additional tuition so that they could accept her. She could be a full student in the First Ascent Scholars. And another student of mine ended up getting a full ride to Westminster when they saw that there was a barrier economically for her. So I'm giving you these examples about the way adults can better work with each other despite their ideological conditioning and create environments in which our students actually have a future, and it's a future for Utah as well. So thank you so much, everybody. And Aaron will talk, and I'm sure I'll get other questions. But I just want to thank you for being such a great colleague and an innovative thinker who's, kind of a practical, down-to-earth guy like me. So I just want to thank you, Aaron.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure.
And thanks, everybody.